I am Brooke Miller, and for 34 years. Just 4 weeks ago, right after we buried our parents, my older brother threw me out. He sneered at me and declared, "Dad always made it clear that the sons take the empire, daughters just take what they are given. This is my property now." He literally deadbolted the doors of the very home I sacrificed everything for. The home where I spent 3 agonizing years nursing our cancer-stricken mother while he showed up exactly 4 times. The home where I wiped her tears during brutal chemo while he stood in the doorway checking his expensive watch. He tossed my whole life into the dirt, calling me a worthless freeloader. My father raised him to believe women were just background noise, but my brother was completely oblivious to one massive detail. For nearly a decade, our quiet mother had been plotting her brilliant revenge. 9 years of hidden trust funds and secret attorneys, meticulously designing an unbreakable fortress of wealth that his greedy hands could never touch. Before I tell you what happened at the will reading, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now let me tell you how a worthless daughter ended up with everything. To understand what my brother Mason did, you have to understand the house we grew up in. My father, Richard Miller, built his entire world on one solid, unshakable rule. Sons carry the legacy forward. Daughters? They marry well and vanish into someone else's shadow. He was never violently cruel about it. He just handed out his love the same way he managed his money, allocating it only toward things that offered a return on investment. And in his eyes, I wasn't one of them. We lived in a massive 5-bedroom colonial in the Colorado suburbs. It looked like the American dream from the outside. Inside, it was a shrine to Mason. My dad spent his weekends in the garage, teaching his golden boy how to build, how to lead, and how to conquer. I stayed in the kitchen with Mom. My mother, Laura, was the quiet heartbeat of that house. Every morning she was out in the backyard, her hands deep in the soil of her lavender garden. "She smells like earth and peace," I used to think as a little girl. She had this magic way of softening my father's sharp edges, of making his complete blindness to me feel a little less like a knife to the chest. Mason, 7 years older than me, swallowed Dad's worldview whole. When he graduated, Dad proudly paid for his business degree at Utah. When Mason decided to dabble in real estate, Dad handed him a golden Rolodex, connecting him with every wealthy developer he knew. But when I nervously asked for help with nursing school, Dad barely looked up from his desk. "Girls don't need expensive educations, Brooke. You'll just get married anyway." "Fine," I told myself, biting the inside of my cheek until it bled. "I'll do it myself." I hunted down scholarships. I worked exhausting double shifts at a greasy diner until my feet went completely numb. I paid for every single textbook with my own sweat. I still remember a specific night, exactly 9 years ago. We were at the dinner table. Dad casually tossed Mason the shiny keys to a brand new car, barely glancing at the nursing school acceptance letter sitting right next to my plate. After dinner, Mom pulled me into the dark hallway, her fingers squeezing mine so hard it almost hurt. "I've taken care of you," she whispered, her eyes fierce and shining in the dim light. "You won't understand now, but I have." I thought it was just a mother's empty comfort. I had absolutely no idea she had spent that exact afternoon sitting across from a lawyer named Elaine Carter, signing papers that would eventually blow our family's foundation to pieces. Fast forward to 3 years ago. The call came while I was halfway through a chaotic shift at Meadowbrook Senior Living. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Dad's number. He never called me at work. He barely called me at all. "Your mother's sick," he said. His voice was flat, hollow. "You need to come home." Not "we need you," just "you need to come home." Like it was my assigned duty. Like it always had been. I didn't hesitate. I packed my life into boxes and moved back into my childhood bedroom within 4 days. I switched to grueling night shifts so I could sit with Mom while the sun was up. I drove her to the endless chemotherapy appointments. I held her hair through the sickness. I watched the terrible, slow fading that cancer forces on a person. My paycheck was slashed by 25%, but I didn't care. "This is Mom," I thought, holding her fragile hand. "There is no other choice." Mason's choice was different. He visited exactly 4 times in 3 long years. 4. Each visit was a timed 60-minute performance. He would sweep into the sick room wearing a sharp Hugo Boss suit, press a dry kiss to Mom's sweaty forehead, check his gold Rolex, and walk out. His wife, Valerie, came once. She spent the entire hour taking pictures of the living room for memories, acting like my mother was already a ghost. Dad completely ignored my sacrifices. To him, I was just doing what daughters were built for. But Mom saw me. During her better weeks, she started having me drive her to an office in Harrisonburg twice a month. Just insurance paperwork, she claimed. I'd wait in the parking lot. Whenever she came back out, she looked lighter, as if she had dropped a heavy stone she'd been dragging for miles. "You're such a good girl," she whispered to me one night, as I tucked a thin blanket around her shoulders. "Whatever happens, Brooke, remember you did everything right. You showed up. That matters more than anyone knows." I thought she was talking about surviving the cancer. She wasn't. You need to understand Mason and Valerie's world. They lived in Georgetown in a 6-bedroom mansion where the mailboxes cost more than my car. Valerie called herself a socialite. She went to art galleries, drank expensive wine, and posted pictures of her designer bags online. Whenever she looked at me, her eyes glazed over. To her, I wasn't family. I was the hired help. Background noise. "Brooke," she said over Thanksgiving dinner, the last one Mom was strong enough to cook. "Have you ever thought about doing something with actual upward mobility? You can't wipe old people's bottoms forever." Mom's knuckles went white around her fork. "I'm a registered nurse," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I keep people alive." Valerie let out a delicate, mocking little laugh. "Of course you do." But the real gut punch came hours later. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water and froze in the dark hallway. Mason and Valerie were whispering furiously near the stairs. "Don't worry about her," Mason hissed. "Dad's already promised everything to me. Has been for years. She's not getting a dime. She's just here to play nurse until Mom's gone. Then she can disappear back into whatever sad little life she has." "Good," Valerie whispered back, her voice shaking with something dark and urgent. "We need this, Mason. We really, really need this." I stood perfectly still in the shadows, my heart hammering against my ribs, the water glass cold in my hand. Need this? The sheer desperation in Valerie's voice didn't match their perfect Georgetown life, the designer clothes or their arrogant smiles. Something was rotting beneath their shiny surface. I went back to my room, telling myself to forget it. I had no idea how dangerous that desperation was about to become. 7 weeks ago, the impossible happened. Mom was declared cancer-free. I sobbed openly in the oncologist's office. After 3 years of pure terror, of watching her shrink and pale and fight, she had actually won. We went to her favorite cafe, and she ordered a glass of champagne, her eyes sparkling with real life for the first time in years. The nightmare was finally over. Or so I thought, because the true nightmare, the one that would leave me standing in the freezing rain with my entire life thrown into wet cardboard boxes, was just days away from beginning. "I want to visit my mother," she said. "Grandma Elizabeth lived at an assisted living facility in Colorado. Your father had been promising to drive her for months. 5 weeks ago, they finally went. They never came back. A tired truck driver fell asleep on Interstate 70. The police told me it was instant. They promised me my parents didn't suffer. I don't know if that's true. Honestly, I don't know if authorities say anything else to grieving families. I was working the night shift when the hospital phone rang. I remember walking numbly to the stairwell because the hallway suddenly felt like it had no oxygen. I can't breathe. I sank onto the icy concrete steps. My cell phone clattered to the floor. The Colorado State Police still on the line, a tiny, tinny voice asking if I was there. I don't remember what I whispered back. I don't even remember driving home, but I vividly remember the thick, sweet smell of Mom's lavender garden when I pulled into the empty driveway at 4 a.m. She will never touch this soil again. The thought shattered me. The funeral was held 5 days later at St. Anthony's Episcopal, the beautiful, echoing church where my parents were married. 90 people filled the wooden pews. Mason delivered the eulogy. He stood at the pulpit for 8 agonizing minutes, talking endlessly about Dad's brilliant business strategies. He mentioned our mother's name exactly 3 times, before the reception even ended, while I was still shaking hands and accepting tearful hugs from people who actually knew and loved her. My brother pulled me aside. "We need to talk," he said, his tone entirely corporate. "About the house." The funeral flowers were still fresh, the air still heavy with grief, when my own flesh and blood informed me I no longer had a home. "You need to clear out your things by the end of the month," Mason instructed, keeping his voice dangerously low so the other mourners wouldn't overhear. We were standing in the church vestibule, the stained glass casting harsh, colored shadows across his perfectly shaved jaw. "The house is mine now. Dad made that clear years ago." I stared at him, my mind spinning out of control. My black dress still had a crumpled tissue tucked into the sleeve from sobbing during the burial. "Mason, we haven't even read the will yet. The will is just a formality. He casually straightened his tie, a Halston I noticed absently. You know how Dad felt. Sons inherit. That's how it's always been. You should be grateful I'm giving you 10 days. Grateful. The word choked me like ash. Look, he softened his voice into a fake reasonable tone that might have fooled a stranger. I understand this is hard. You've been living there, taking care of things, but that was your choice. You could have had a real career, a real life. Instead, you chose to play nurse. That's not my fault. Behind him, Valerie was sighing, checking her phone screen, visibly bored by my tears. That's not fair, Mason. I took care of Mom for 3 years. While you? While I what? His eyes turned instantly to ice. While I built something? While I made something of myself. Don't pretend wiping bedpans is the same as running a business, Brooke. We both know what you are. He stepped back, coldly adjusting his expensive cuffs. 10 days, then I'm changing the locks. I watched him walk back to his wife. I watched her lean in and smirk. I watched them walk out the grand double doors without saying goodbye to a single person. That was Tuesday. He didn't even wait the 10 days. Thursday evening, exactly 3 days after we buried our parents, I came home from the hospital at 8 o'clock. I was exhausted in a deep, bone-crushing way that had nothing to do with a long shift. Grief does that to you. It makes every step feel like you're dragging weights through thick water. That was when my key wouldn't turn. The deadbolt had been replaced. Panic rising, I jogged around to the side of the garage. My stomach dropped into freefall. My clothes, my books, every single thing I owned had been carelessly thrown into cardboard moving boxes and shoved against the damp brick wall. A heavy afternoon storm had soaked right through them. I pulled open a soggy, tearing flap. My nursing school diploma, the one I had sacrificed so much for, was warped, waterlogged, and ruined. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. He answered on the third ring, sounding incredibly smug. The house is legally mine, Mason stated, not even bothering to fake an apology. I had my lawyer verify it. Dad's estate, Dad's house, Dad's decision. You have 48 hours to get your junk off the property before I hire someone to haul it to the dump. Mason, I grew up here. You don't even live here anymore. That's how life works, Brooke. Maybe if you'd actually made something of yourself, you wouldn't be standing in the rain right now. I hung up because if I spoke, I would scream until my throat bled. I sank down onto the wet grass next to my ruined life. I reached into my coat pocket and gripped the only thing that hadn't been destroyed. Mom's scratched Tissot watch, handed back to me by the hospital nurses. Then my blood ran cold. I scrambled through the soggy boxes, frantically tossing ruined sweaters aside, searching for the one item I truly cared about. Mom's wooden recipe box. It wasn't there. He threw it away. He thought it was trash. A sickening jolt of pure adrenaline hit my bloodstream. I couldn't leave it inside. I wouldn't. I remembered a loose metal latch on the basement window, a secret from when I was a teenager sneaking out. Shivering violently from the freezing rain and anger, I popped it open. I slid inside my own childhood home like a criminal. The house was terrifyingly dark and empty. I crept upstairs to Mom's bedroom. Valerie had already started packing it up. Mom's personal treasures, her clothes, her memories, were shoved mercilessly into cheap black garbage bags. Tears blinded me as I dug through the plastic, ripping the bags open. Finally, my freezing fingers brushed the familiar, worn wood of the recipe box. I popped the delicate lid. Inside, tucked safely beneath her favorite soup cards, was a thick cream-colored envelope. My name was written across the front in her shaky handwriting. For Brooke, when the time comes. My heart leaped into my throat. I turned to climb back out the window, but the floorboards downstairs groaned loudly. I froze in the absolute darkness. Heavy footsteps were stomping up the stairs, and my brother wasn't alone. We bulldozed the lavender garden first. A strange, oily voice echoed above me. I froze in the hallway shadow, my breath catching in my throat. It was Mr. Vance, a notoriously sleazy appraiser Mason used for his sketchy property flips. You can easily fit a massive extension right there, Vance continued, a harsh flashlight beam slicing through the dark window and onto Mom's precious yard. Add a pool, maybe a luxury cabana. We can flip this place for double the market value in 2 months. Mason chuckled. It was a cold, greedy sound that made my skin crawl. Just get the demolition permits ready, Vance. I want that useless weed patch completely gone by next week. My blood boiled, hot and fierce. He isn't even mourning, I realized, pressing my back against the wall. He is already erasing her. I clutched the cream-colored envelope tightly against my chest. slipped silently backward down the hall, and climbed out the basement window into the pouring rain. I didn't open her letter on that soaked lawn. I simply couldn't. My hands were shaking too violently. Instead, shivering and drenched, I called the only person I could trust, Donna Fletcher. She was the tough, no-nonsense head nurse at Meadowbrook who had acted as a mentor to me for 4 years. Her trusty Honda Odyssey whipped around the corner within 45 minutes. "Get in," Donna ordered, taking one look at my pale face and asking absolutely zero questions. "You're staying with me tonight, tomorrow, and as long as you need." Her apartment was tiny. It was a cramped 2-bedroom unit in a Harrisonburg complex that had clearly seen better days, but it was incredibly warm, safe, and dry. When she wrapped a thick wool blanket around my shoulders and handed me a steaming cup of chamomile tea, the dam finally broke. I sobbed until my lungs ached, mourning the parents I lost and the brother who never truly existed. Later, sitting on the edge of the guest bed when my breathing finally slowed, I opened Mom's envelope. The handwriting inside was incredibly shaky. She must have penned it during the peak of her chemotherapy, back when her fragile hands trembled constantly. "My darling Brooke, if you are reading this, then exactly what I feared has happened. Your father and your brother have shown you exactly who they are. I want you to know, I saw it. I always saw it. I couldn't change your father. God knows I tried with every ounce of my strength, but I realized early on that I could protect you from him. Contact Elaine Carter at Henderson & Carter in Harrisonburg. She possesses everything you need. All the heavy legal papers, all the secret arrangements, everything I couldn't hand to you while I was alive. You are not a burden. You never were. You are the single best thing I ever did with my life. I love you more than lavender, more than sunshine, and more than every good thing on this earth." Mom, I read the page 4 times before the blurry ink made sense. She knew. She fought a silent war for me. I immediately dialed the phone number she had carefully written at the bottom edge of the paper. Henderson & Carter occupied a stunning brownstone in downtown Harrisonburg. It was the kind of old-money establishment adorned with polished brass nameplates and thick hardwood floors that creaked with quiet history. I felt painfully underdressed in my clean hospital scrubs, but the elegant assistant merely smiled and led me straight to a corner office bathed in soft afternoon light. Elaine Carter was not what I pictured. She was in her late 60s, her silver hair swept into a flawless French twist, wearing a sharp charcoal Armani suit. But her dark eyes were incredibly warm when she reached out to shake my hand. "Brooke," she said softly, "I've been waiting for your call. Your mother spoke about you constantly." That tiny sentence almost broke me all over again. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "She left me a letter. She claimed you had papers." Elaine gestured gracefully to a plush leather chair. "I do. Your mother and I worked closely together for 9 years, Brooke. She was easily one of the most deliberate, brilliant people I've ever represented." 9 years? My mind raced. That was the exact same time frame Mom had pulled me aside in the hallway, whispering fiercely after I got accepted into nursing school. "Your mother fully understood your father's intentions," Elaine explained carefully, leaning across her massive mahogany desk. "She knew Mason would inherit absolutely everything Richard controlled. She couldn't change those deep-rooted beliefs, but she could plan around them." "What does that actually mean?" Elaine folded her manicured hands. "It means your mother spent a decade quietly building arrangements that exist entirely outside your father's estate. Arrangements that Mason knows nothing about. Things your father never discovered." The sprawling office suddenly felt very small. "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind you'll learn about at the formal will reading next week. Both of your parents' wills must be read together." She paused, her gaze turning serious and sharp. "But I need you to trust me completely until then. Can you do that? Whatever Mason says to you, however viciously he threatens you, do not react. Do not sign a single document. Just wait." "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Her smile grew slow and almost gentle. "Because your mother is about to have the final word." 4 torturous days before the scheduled reading, my phone lit up. It was 11 p.m. I was sitting at Donna's small kitchen table, the overhead lights dim, trying to read a medical textbook without absorbing a single word. Mason's name flashing on the screen made my stomach instantly clench into tight knots. "Brooke?" His tone was smooth, almost friendly, which was somehow far worse than his usual hostility. "I've been thinking about this messy situation. Us being at odds. It's really not good for anyone. You kicked me out of my childhood home 3 days after burying our parents, Mason." I know. I admit I could have handled it much better." He actually sounded apologetic. That's exactly why I'm calling. I want to make this right. I waited, gripping the plastic edge of the table. I've drawn up a very simple agreement, he continued smoothly. You sign away any legal claim to contest the estate, and in exchange I will personally wire you $15,000 in cash. That is plenty to get yourself settled somewhere nice. $15,000 for a lifetime of being treated like a ghost. For 3 exhausting years of bathing our dying mother while he visited 4 times. For every cruel dismissal, every snide comment, every single moment he and my father made me feel like I was stealing air that belonged to someone worthier. No, Brooke, please be reasonable, Mason pushed, sensing my silence. You're absolutely not going to win anything in a probate court. Dad's will is airtight. All you'll do is waste money on cheap lawyers and drag this ugly mess out for months. Take the money. Start over fresh. No, Mason, I whispered into the receiver, my spine straightening as a new, unfamiliar power surged through my veins. I'll see you at the reading. I hung up the phone, my heart racing, completely unaware of the absolute hellfire my mother had prepared for him in that room. I'll see you at the will reading. His voice hardened instantly, the fake warmth vanishing like a blown-out candle. You're making a massive mistake. You know that, right? You're going to walk out of that room with nothing, less than nothing, and you will beg for this offer. Then that is my choice to make, I replied, my grip tightening on the plastic receiver. Fine. He practically spat the syllable. But remember, I tried to be generous. What happens next is entirely on your head. The line clicked dead. I set the phone down, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Then I did exactly what Elaine had instructed. I simply waited. Listen to me for a second. Have you ever been pushed into a corner by your own family? Have you ever been pressured to sign away your basic rights? Told you don't deserve what is fair? That specific, suffocating helplessness, it burns into your soul. It stays with you forever. If this part of my life feels familiar to you, hold on to that feeling. Because what happened next inside that law office didn't just change my future, it rewrote my entire past. Friday arrived, gray and heavy. At exactly 3 p.m., I walked into the grand conference room at Henderson and Carter. A massive mahogany table stretched across the floor, long enough to seat 14 people. Only 6 chairs were filled. Mason and Valerie sat on one side, whispering confidently. Elaine Carter sat at the head, her assistant acting as an official witness. I took my seat. And then, to my brother's visible shock, the heavy oak door opened one last time. My grandmother, Elizabeth Winters, walked in. Mason's smug grin faltered instantly. I didn't know you were coming. Grandma was 84, but her mind was sharper than a steel trap. She wore a crisp navy dress, her silver hair pinned neatly back. The famous sapphire ring she had worn since I was a toddler glinted fiercely under the chandelier. I was asked to be here, she stated simply, pulling out the chair right next to mine. By my daughter. Mason exchanged a nervous glance with Valerie. He quickly cleared his throat, recovering his arrogant posture. Well, the more the merrier, I suppose, though I honestly don't see why we need to overcomplicate things. Dad's wishes were crystal clear. The room instantly thickened, feeling like a pressure cooker about to explode. Here we go, I thought, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Elaine skipped the polite introductions. She adjusted her glasses, opening the first of several thick folders perfectly aligned on her desk. Before we dive in, I must note that we will be executing 2 separate documents today, Richard Miller's will and Laura Miller's will. They feature entirely distinct provisions. 2 wills? Valerie frowned, her perfectly plucked eyebrows drawing together. Why does that matter? Everything they had was jointly owned. Elaine's expression did not shift a single millimeter. Not everything, as it turns out. Under the table, Grandma's soft, wrinkled hand found mine. She squeezed it tight. I'm right here, the gesture said. Mason shot his cuffs, shooting a glare at the lawyer. Fine, let's just get this over with. Read Dad's first. Very well. Elaine unsealed the crisp pages. The last will and testament of Richard Allen Miller, dated 15 months ago, officially witnessed and notarized. The space fell dead silent. This was the moment of truth. Dad's final words were exactly what my brother had banked on. Elaine swiftly navigated the boring legal jargon. Debt payments, funeral instructions, executor appointments, before reaching the distribution of assets. To my son, Mason Richard Miller, I leave 75% of my personal assets, including my vehicle, my workshop tools, and my share of all financial accounts held jointly with my wife. Mason nodded slowly, a deep, victorious satisfaction spreading across his face. To my daughter, Brooke Lynn Miller, I leave 25% of my remaining personal assets. 25% of remaining assets, Valerie murmured, rapidly crunching the numbers in her head. After debts and basic expenses, so basically nothing. That's not. I started to object, my cheeks burning with sudden humiliation. It's totally fine, Mason cut in, acting like a generous king tossing crumbs to a peasant. Dad's accounts totaled roughly 90,000. You'll get something, Brooke. Maybe 22 grand after the dust settles. He beamed at me, genuinely believing he was doing me a massive favor. Honestly, that's way more than I ever expected Dad to leave you. Mason, Grandma said, her tone dangerously quiet. Perhaps you could zip your lips and let the professional finish. What is left to finish? He leaned casually back in his plush leather chair, draping one arm over the armrest. The house was Dad's. The real money was Dad's. I am the primary heir. Brooke gets a tiny consolation prize, which is incredibly generous given the circumstances. Beside him, Valerie picked up her smartphone, her thumbs flying across the screen. She was probably already bragging about her new inheritance online. Actually, Elaine's voice cracked through the air like a bullwhip, instantly shattering my brother's victory lap. There is quite a bit left to discuss. Richard's document represents only a tiny fraction of your parents' combined estate. Combined? Mason's smugness faltered. He sat up straight. What do you mean, combined? Elaine calmly closed his father's folder and placed her hand flat on the second one. Your mother's estate is entirely separate, and it is significantly larger than your father's. The entire room stopped breathing. The confident smirk completely melted off Mason's face. Wait, he held up both hands. Mom didn't have her own estate. She was a stay-at-home housewife. Every single penny she had came from Dad. That is legally inaccurate, Elaine stated without blinking. It is accurate. I know my own family. Mason stood up abruptly, trying to use his height to intimidate the room. Whatever you are about to read, whatever sad little savings account Mom managed to scrape together, it changes absolutely nothing. Dad made his grand plan clear for decades. The son inherits the empire. The daughter takes what she is handed and says thank you. He turned his furious gaze on me, the familiar toxic venom spilling out. This is exactly what I tried to spare you from, Brooke. This pathetic embarrassment. You're sitting here praying Mom left you something special? What? Her cheap jewelry? Her soup recipes? It does not matter. He leaned across the mahogany wood, his eyes burning with absolute certainty, ready to deliver the final killing blow to my hopes. But he had absolutely no idea that the quiet woman he had underestimated his entire life had just set a trap he could never escape. The house is still Dad's. Mason leaned closer across the massive table, practically snarling at me. The real money is still Dad's, and you are still exactly the same pathetic person you've always been. Mason, Grandma warned, her wrinkled fingers tightening around mine under the polished wood. Her voice was incredibly low, but it commanded the room. He completely ignored her. I hope you enjoy being homeless, Brooke, because I personally made sure you have zero safety net. No home, no family support, nothing. Maybe next time you'll think twice before. Mr. Miller. Elaine's voice didn't rise in volume, but the sheer absolute authority in it cracked through his tirade like a whip. Sit down. The command was so sudden, so incredibly unexpected from a polite lawyer, that Mason actually obeyed. He dropped back into his heavy leather chair, his jaw clenched tight enough to snap a tooth. I fully understand you have strong opinions about how your parents' assets should be distributed, Elaine continued, her dark eyes completely unbothered by his tantrum. But this is a strict legal proceeding, not a messy family argument in a living room. Your mother's will contains very specific provisions that completely supersede your assumptions. If you interrupt me again, I will have my assistant escort you out, and you will receive this information via certified mail. Valerie grabbed Mason's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit sleeve. Her eyes were suddenly wide and darting frantically between Elaine's calm face and her husband's furious one. Her arrogant, socialite composure was rapidly crumbling into sheer, desperate panic. She knew Vance was waiting on the house sale. She needed this money. Mason sat rigidly back in his chair, breathing hard through his nose. Elaine smoothly picked up the second thick folder. And now, she announced clearly, we address the matter of Laura Miller's estate. This includes the final section your mother specifically asked me to read aloud in this room. For one terrible, breath-stealing moment, I doubted absolutely everything. Mason's cruel words echoed loudly in my head. Mom was a housewife. Everything she had came from Dad. What if he was actually right? What if the cryptic letter, the expensive lawyer, the quiet promises? What if it was all just a dying mother desperately trying to comfort a daughter she knew would be left behind? I looked down at the scratched Tissot watch wrapped around my wrist. Mom's watch. The leather band was cracked and worn from years of daily use. The simple face was scuffed. She could have easily afforded something much nicer. I knew that now. But she chose to wear this exact one every single day, until the afternoon she died. What did she actually have the power to leave me? Valerie was practically hyperventilating next to Mason. She leaned in, her whisper sharp and frantic in the silent room. She probably just has some basic life insurance or something. A few $1,000s. Nothing that changes our actual situation. Our situation? The specific phrase caught my attention. What situation was Valerie terrified of? Grandma's hand was still firmly holding mine. I felt her squeeze again. Firmer this time, as if she could magically sense my sudden wavering. "Brooke," she murmured, so quietly only I could hear the fierce pride in her voice. "Your mother was easily the smartest woman I ever raised. Trust her." I looked up at Elaine. The older woman was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It was incredibly patient, almost anticipatory. "I'm ready," I said, my voice finally steady. Mason snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Ready for severe disappointment?" Valerie let out a nervous laugh, but it sounded terrifyingly close to a sob. Elaine ignored them both. She unsealed the heavy folder and slowly removed several crisp documents. From my seat I could clearly see official, raised seals, bright blue notarized stamps, and pages dense with complicated legal text. "The last will and testament of Laura Elizabeth Miller," she began, her tone perfectly measured. "Updated 19 months ago. Witnessed by myself and a licensed notary public of Harrison County. The testator was thoroughly evaluated by Dr. Susan Harrison, a board-certified psychiatrist, and declared fully competent to execute this document." She looked directly across the mahogany wood at Mason. "The first item is a personal letter Mrs. Miller formally requested I read aloud to all present." Mason immediately shifted in his seat, a sneer forming. 19 months ago. Mom was right in the middle of heavy chemo 19 months ago. Her judgment was completely compromised by drugs. "I fully anticipated that precise concern," Elaine replied smoothly, without missing a single beat. "Which is exactly why I have Dr. Harrison's written, sworn evaluation confirming your mother's full cognitive capacity at the exact time of signing. I also have official video documentation of the signing itself." She reached into her pocket, produced a small silver USB drive, and set it on the table with a soft clack. "Your mother wanted absolutely no ambiguity. She recorded herself clearly explaining every single decision in this document. The video is 35 minutes long and is readily available for review if anyone wishes to contest her legal competency." Valerie's phone had completely stopped moving in her lap. She stared at the tiny silver drive like it was a live grenade. Mason swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "That's very thorough. Your mother was an incredibly thorough woman." Elaine's lips curved just slightly at the edges. "Now the letter." She lifted a single page. It was handwritten on heavy cream-colored stationery. I instantly recognized the beautiful paper. Mom kept a special box of it hidden in the back of her desk, the expensive kind she only ever used for deeply important correspondence. "To my children," Elaine read, her voice ringing clear and strong in the heavy silence. "If you are hearing this letter, then I am gone, and the terrible moment I have dreaded for decades has finally arrived." My throat instantly tightened, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. "I love you both. I want you to know that first. But love does not make me blind." Mason went completely, unnervingly still. "For 36 years I quietly watched your father favor Mason in ways he didn't even recognize as blatant favoritism. To Richard, it was simply how he saw the natural order of the world. Sons truly matter, daughters serve. I could not change him. Believe me, I tried with everything I had." Elaine paused, her dark eyes looking up at us. "There is more," she noted softly. "But perhaps I should continue after everyone has had a moment to breathe." "Keep reading," Mason ordered tightly, his knuckles turning white on the armrests. Elaine nodded, and I braced myself. As Elaine continued reading, the absolute silence in the room shattered. My mother's voice seemed to completely fill the space, reaching back from the grave to finally tell the devastating truth she had hidden for nearly 40 years. Elaine continued reading, and my mother's voice seemed to fill the room, reaching back from the grave to finally shatter the illusion we had lived in. I watched her work double shifts until she could barely stand, paying her own way through nursing school while Mason received every imaginable advantage simply by asking. I watched my daughter come home to care for me during the absolute darkest 3 years of my life. She gently changed my soiled sheets when the pain was too severe for me to move. She held my trembling hand during endless chemotherapy sessions. She sang the exact same lullabies to me that I used to sing to her when she was a little girl. A tear slipped down my cheek, hot and fast. Mason visited exactly 4 times, 4 brief hours in 3 agonizing years. I do not write this letter to condemn my son. I write it to finally explain why I made the firm choices I did today. The assets I leave to Brooke are not a reward. They are not a sign of favoritism. They are the long overdue balance I could not safely provide while I was alive. They are exactly what she was always owed. Valerie let out a small, strangled gasp, pressing a manicured hand over her mouth. If Mason is hearing my words and feels angry, I understand, but I firmly challenge him to consider this. Why does he feel so blindly entitled to everything? Who taught him that toxic lesson? And what did he actually do to earn his comfortable life, other than being born male? Mason's face drained of all color. The arrogant, untouchable businessman was suddenly gone, replaced by a pale, shocked stranger. Elaine looked up from the page, her expression softening for the first time. The letter concludes with this: Brooke, my darling girl, you are never a burden. You are my entire heart. Live well, be incredibly happy, and never let anyone tell you that you do not deserve every single good thing. With all my love, forever, Mom. The silence that followed was absolute. It pressed heavily against my chest. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even pull air into my lungs. Grandma silently reached over and pressed a soft tissue into my shaking palm. Now, Elaine said quietly, seamlessly shifting from messenger back to a razor-sharp attorney. Let's discuss what your mother actually left you. She pulled a crisp document from the heavy folder. First, the house. Mason instantly snapped out of his daze, his spine straightening rigidly. The house is a core part of Dad's estate. It was always in his name. Actually, it wasn't. Elaine slid the thick paper across the polished mahogany. 6 years ago, your parents executed a quiet deed transfer. The property at 127 Meadow Drive was legally transferred from joint ownership into Laura Miller's sole exclusive name. What? Mason snatched the paper off the table, his eyes darting frantically across the text. That's impossible. Why would Dad ever agree to that? For severe liability protection. Elaine folded her hands neatly. Your father was facing a massive, catastrophic lawsuit from a dissatisfied client at the time. Moving your childhood home entirely into your mother's name legally protected the property from any harsh court judgments against his contracting business. It is a fairly common estate planning strategy. I never heard a single word about any lawsuit, Mason argued, his voice rising in panic. It was supposedly settled out of court. However, the deed transfer remained permanent. Elaine smoothly produced a second document. This is the officially recorded deed from the Harrison County Land Records, dated exactly 6 years ago. The property, currently valued at approximately $700,000, belonged solely and completely to your mother. Valerie's face turned a strange, sickly shade of gray. But that means your mother had the full, unquestionable authority to leave that property to whomever she chose, Elaine finished. She turned her warm gaze toward me. And she chose you, Brooke. No. Mason violently shook his head, slapping the document back down onto the table. No, this has to be a clerical mistake. Dad always said he owned that property. He swore it. Your father deeply believed what he desperately wanted to believe, Grandma stated sharply, her voice cutting through his denial. Laura told him the deed transfer was just temporary to survive the lawsuit. She simply never transferred it back, and his massive ego meant he never bothered to double-check. A lawsuit? Mason scoffed loudly, standing up again, his face burning red with furious denial. Dad was never sued. This is a complete, insane fabrication to steal my rightful property. Elaine didn't flinch. Her calm demeanor was utterly terrifying. She simply picked up a heavily sealed manila envelope and broke the tab. He wasn't sued, Mr. Miller, because your mother bravely stopped it. The dissatisfied client was actually the Internal Revenue Service and several of his major private investors. Your father was deeply involved in massive systemic embezzlement and tax fraud. He was literally weeks away from federal prison. Mason staggered backward, his hip hitting the hard edge of the conference table. You're lying. I have the undeniable documentation right here, Elaine replied, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. Your mother intercepted the damning files. She bravely blackmailed your father. She told him she would keep the deed to the house in her name forever, or she would personally hand the hidden evidence to the authorities. She saved him from total bankruptcy and a concrete cell, but she made absolutely sure he could never ever touch that house again. The entire room violently spun around me. The arrogant, dominating patriarch who treated women like invisible background noise had secretly been saved by the quiet woman tending the lavender garden. I stared blindly at the deed, tracing my mother's neat, deliberate signature at the bottom. The house where I grew up. The home where I painfully nursed her through cancer. The very same property Mason had ruthlessly thrown me out of 3 days ago. The place he was actively planning to let a sleazy appraiser bulldoze. It was mine. It had legally been mine this entire time, but Elaine didn't give my brother a single second to breathe. She continued right through his shock as if she hadn't just detonated a massive bomb in the middle of the room. Additionally, Elaine announced, her voice ringing out like a judge delivering a final sentence, there is the critical matter of the irrevocable trust. The what? Mason gasped, looking exactly like he had been physically struck. 9 years ago, your mother formally established an irrevocable trust with Brooke as the sole exclusive beneficiary. An irrevocable trust, once established, cannot be modified, touched, or dissolved without the beneficiary's explicit consent. It exists entirely outside the normal probate process. 9 years ago. That was the exact night Mom pulled me into the dark hallway after Dad gave Mason the car keys. Mason wildly turned his furious glare toward my grandmother. You helped her hide this. You gave her the money. Grandma didn't blink. She sat perfectly tall. I gave my daughter money that was rightfully mine to give. What she bravely chose to do with it to protect her child was her own brilliant business. The trust was fully funded with a $450,000 cash gift from Mrs. Winters, Elaine confirmed, scanning a thick spreadsheet. Your mother secretly invested it very conservatively in solid index funds over the past 9 years. The current value, she paused, running her finger down the final column, is approximately $1.4 million. Valerie made a horrible gagging sound, as if someone had just punched her squarely in the stomach. 1.4 million, Mason repeated slowly, his brain completely short-circuiting. That is correct, Elaine nodded, but the lawyer's hand was already moving toward a final, unseen folder, ready to reveal a secret that would push my brother completely past the point of no return. And because this trust is absolutely irrevocable, funded entirely by your grandmother's private cash gifts, Elaine continued, her voice slicing cleanly through the heavy air. It was never mixed with marital assets. It never legally belonged to your father's estate. It has always, from the very first day, belonged to Brooke. I couldn't process the numbers. $1.4 million. My mind went completely blank. My sweet, humble mother, who cheerfully grew her own vegetables and wore the exact same scuffed Tissot watch every single day, had quietly built me a massive hidden fortune. All those painful years I thought I was barely scraping by. She was moving mountains in the dark. This is blatant fraud, Mason sputtered, his expensive cuffs trembling violently. Dad didn't know about this. He would never have allowed. Your father's knowledge is entirely irrelevant, Elaine interrupted smoothly. The trust was lawfully established with money that was never his to control. He had zero claim to it, and neither do you. The tiny silver USB drive sat on the polished table, untouched. 35 minutes of my dying mother bravely explaining why she had to protect me from the greedy men in her own family. There is one final asset, Elaine announced. Mason looked like he might actually be sick. Valerie's white-knuckled grip on his suit jacket was violently shaking. Your mother held a private life insurance policy with Nationwide Mutual, officially valued at $600,000. Elaine paused intentionally, letting the massive sum hang heavy in the suffocating room. The sole beneficiary was designated as Brooke Lynn Miller. Mom had life insurance? I sat frozen in my chair. I hadn't known any of this. She discreetly purchased the policy 13 years ago, when Brooke was only 17. She faithfully paid the monthly premiums from her personal checking account, using the annual birthday money your grandmother sent her. Your father was never listed on the paperwork. But I am her son, Mason yelled, standing up so fast his heavy leather chair skidded backward across the carpet. Something in his voice had finally cracked wide open. It wasn't arrogant anger anymore. It was naked, raw desperation. I am her firstborn. She can't just leave me with absolutely nothing. She didn't leave you nothing, Mr. Miller. Elaine calmly pulled out a single, thin page. Your mother's will clearly specifies that you are to legally receive all of her personal effects, her photograph albums, her entire jewelry collection, and a handwritten letter she wrote specifically for you. A letter? Mason let out a loud, hollow, broken laugh. She leaves Brooke millions in cash, and I get a piece of paper? And some cheap jewelry? The collection contains deeply meaningful family pieces, Elaine offered gently. I don't want her stupid jewelry. Mason slammed his open palm violently onto the mahogany table. Valerie violently flinched. I want what I was promised. I want what I legally earned. What he earned. The selfish words triggered something deep inside me. I spoke before I could physically stop myself. My voice came out quiet, but it commanded the entire room. You want what you earned? I stood up slowly, matching his height across the table. You couldn't even remember the exact hallway to Mom's bedroom, Mason. You visited 4 times in 3 agonizing years. He stared at me, his chest heaving rapidly. I stared fiercely back. You looked me in the eye and told me I was nothing but a heavy burden while I was holding her fragile hand through brutal chemotherapy. So tell me, Mason, what exactly did you earn? Let's legally discuss the total figures, Elaine interjected, a faint hint of absolute satisfaction in her professional tone. This is contested, Mason shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the lawyer. Mom wasn't in her right mind. The aggressive chemo, the heavy pain medication. She could not have made these massive financial decisions rationally. Elaine didn't blink. As I clearly mentioned, your mother underwent a rigorous cognitive evaluation by a board-certified psychiatrist completely unaffiliated with her cancer treatment. The medical evaluation firmly concluded that Mrs. Miller understood the exact nature and permanent consequences of her choices. Doctors can be wrong. Additionally, the official signing of her will was recorded on video. Elaine lightly tapped the silver USB drive. In it, your mother brilliantly articulates her specific reasons for each bequest. She also directly addresses the high probability that you might loudly contest this, legally explaining exactly why your challenge will automatically fail. Mason's jaw clamped shut so hard I heard his teeth grind. Furthermore, Elaine continued relentlessly, the irrevocable trust and the life insurance beneficiary designations are entirely immune to will contests. They completely bypass probate court. You have absolutely zero legal standing to challenge them. There has to be something. Mason was rapidly hyperventilating now. If you desperately wish to contest your father's will, you may absolutely do so. Though I strongly advise consulting with your own expensive counsel about the high court costs versus the tiny potential recovery. Elaine's dark gaze was deadly level. As for your mother's brilliant arrangements, she anticipated all of your loud objections, Mr. Miller. She spent 9 focused years making absolutely sure every single document was ironclad. Grandma Elizabeth finally spoke up. My daughter didn't do this out of ugly spite, Mason. We all knew that without extreme protection, Brooke would receive absolutely nothing. And Brooke deserved infinitely better than nothing. Mason turned his furious face toward Grandma. You helped her hide this. You helped her completely cut me out. I helped her proudly protect her daughter, Grandma stated simply, lifting her chin. The exact same thing any good mother would do. Mason had no answer to that harsh truth. But Valerie broke first. This is completely insane, she shrieked, her wealthy socialite composure totally shattering into a million jagged pieces. She is just a nurse. She wipes old people's disgusting behinds for a basic living, and she gets nearly $2 million while you what, Mrs. Miller? Elaine asked mildly, tilting her head. Valerie's mouth popped open and snapped closed. She had said way too much. The sheer terror in her wide eyes proved she knew it. Well, you are about to lose your gorgeous mansion in Georgetown, Grandma said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it echoed like a booming thunderclap in the silent room. Did you honestly think we didn't find out about Mason's massive failed investment? The $450,000 devastating loss? The quiet bank foreclosure notices? Mason went completely, totally white. How do you… Laura knew, Grandma said, a hint of deep, heavy sadness in her eyes. She knew about the secret debts, the terrible real estate deals, the suffocating desperation. She knew you were entirely counting on stealing this inheritance to bail yourself out. She knew Mason was rapidly sinking, and she expertly built an unbreakable fortress around me so he couldn't drag me down with him. But what happened next in that silent room was something nobody, not even my brilliant mother, could have ever predicted. That's exactly why she made sure you couldn't legally touch what she'd quietly built for Brooke. I looked over at my older brother, truly deeply looked at him for the absolute first time in years. The heavy gold Rolex strapped to his wrist, the flawless Hackett London suit tailored perfectly to his shoulders, the shiny Benz waiting arrogantly in the firm's parking lot. Every single piece of it was nothing but an elaborate, hollow scaffolding, a fragile facade built entirely on maxed-out credit, empty promises, and the toxic assumption that our parents' deep pockets would forever be there to catch his reckless falls. You were actively planning to take everything, I said slowly, the terrible truth locking into place. Not because you actually needed Dad's money, because you were completely drowning. I am not drowning, Mason snapped, his voice high and thin, desperately trying to maintain control. I had a temporary setback, that is all. A temporary setback that Dad's estate would have easily saved you from, I finished quietly, staring right into his panicking eyes. Except his estate wasn't exactly what you arrogantly thought it was. Beside him, Valerie sank lifelessly back into her heavy leather chair. Her expensive waterproof mascara was starting to smear down her pale cheeks. The Georgetown socialite was suddenly gone, replaced by a terrified woman realizing she was about to lose her entire identity. You spent your whole miserable life being loudly told you deserved absolutely everything, I said, my voice steady and painfully clear in the dead silence. And you never, not for one single second, stopped to wonder if that was actually true. Mason didn't respond. He physically couldn't. His throat worked convulsively, but no words came out. Take a slow breath here. I know some of you are listening to this right now and thinking, why on earth would Valerie just scream that out loud? Why would she recklessly reveal their massive financial ruin in front of the exact people they were trying to intimidate? The raw answer is absolute terror. Pure, unadulterated fear. When the single desperate lifeline you've been heavily counting on suddenly vanishes into thin air, your primal survival instincts take completely over. You violently stop caring about maintaining perfect appearances. You just panic. If you have ever watched someone's arrogant mask completely shatter under the weight of their own terrible choices, you know exactly what that suffocating moment looks like. Elaine waited gracefully until the long conference room was utterly quiet again before speaking. Her posture was flawless. For the official record, she announced firmly, adjusting her reading glasses, let me summarize the total final assets legally passing to Brooke Miller today. She casually consulted her neat notes, though I highly suspected she already knew the exact numbers by deep heart. From her mother's private estate, the clear property deed at 127 Meadow Drive. Estimated market value, $700,000. Mason swallowed audibly. From the irrevocable trust established secretly in 2017, $1,400,000. Valerie let out another shaky, muffled sob. From the nationwide mutual life insurance policy, $600,000. Elaine finally looked up, her dark eyes completely unreadable. Additionally, from her father's estate, the designated 25% of remaining liquid assets, approximately $22,500. The massive numbers hung heavily in the air, pressing down on all of us. The final total, Elaine concluded, her voice perfectly measured and professional, is approximately $2.722 million. $2.7 million. My sweet mother, who happily grew lavender in the backyard, who wore a scuffed Tissot watch every single day, and never bought anything she didn't absolutely need, had deliberately left me nearly $3 million. Mason made a strange, terrible sound deep in his chest. He was gripping the polished edge of the mahogany table so violently that his knuckles were bone white. His arrogant face had turned the color of old, dusty paper. He tried to stand up, maybe to shout a final protest, maybe just to flee the suffocating room. And then his eyes rolled completely back into his head. He crumpled instantly. His temple caught the sharp edge of the thick table with a sickening thud on the way down, and his heavy body hit the carpet. Valerie screamed, a high, piercing, terrifying sound that shattered the remaining silence. Elaine's assistant was already moving, calmly dialing 911 on the desk phone while kneeling beside him, pressing 2 steady fingers to his neck to check his rapid pulse. I sat perfectly frozen in my chair. I was just staring at my older brother, the golden boy, the untouchable heir, lying completely unconscious on the floor of a law office, utterly brought down by nothing but numbers on a piece of paper. He's breathing, the capable assistant reported clearly. His pulse is steady. He most likely just fainted from extreme shock. Grandma gently squeezed my trembling hand under the table. Your mother would be incredibly proud of you, she said softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Not for the money, Brooke, for exactly who you've become despite all of this. I couldn't even formulate an answer. I was still desperately trying to understand the massive shift in my universe. The paramedics arrived quickly. They officially declared it a syncopal episode, a sudden violent drop in blood pressure triggered by massive emotional shock. Nothing physically dangerous. It was just his arrogant body's absolute refusal to process the devastating reality his mind couldn't accept. They quickly bandaged the small bleeding cut on his pale forehead and strongly recommended he see his primary doctor, but he stubbornly refused transport to the hospital. 30 agonizing minutes after collapsing, Mason was awkwardly back in his leather chair. He was pale, sweating profusely, and incredibly unsteady. Valerie hovered anxiously over him, treating him like fragile glass that might completely shatter at any moment. He finally looked across the massive table at me. "You knew," he rasped hoarsely, his voice raw. "You knew about absolutely all of this." "I didn't. I meant it with my entire soul. Not until just a few days ago, and even then I had no idea how much she had built. But you suspected." He pointed a shaky finger at me. "You sat right there looking so perfectly innocent, and you suspected she was hiding it. I knew Mom loved me." I kept my voice perfectly even, refusing to let him drag me down. "That is absolutely all I knew for certain." His laugh was incredibly bitter, sounding broken in the quiet room. "And I didn't. She didn't love me at all." "I think she loved you," I said slowly, watching the realization hit him like a physical blow. "But she loved who you could have been, Mason. She also clearly saw who you arrogantly chose to become." Valerie's trembling hand tightened on his expensive shoulder pad. "Mason, we should go right now. We need to figure out what?" His voice cracked, sounding entirely like a frightened child instead of a ruthless businessman. "How to pay our massive mortgage? How to tell the angry bank we're not getting a single dime?" He slowly lifted his head and looked at me. His pale eyes held something that might have been genuine desperation. "Brooke, you have to help me, please, we're family." The heavy word hung completely suspended in the stale air. "Family, you threw my entire life into wet cardboard boxes in the freezing rain, Mason." I kept my tone terrifyingly level. "You eagerly handed my childhood home over to a sleazy appraiser named Vance so he could bulldoze Mom's precious garden before the dirt on her grave had even settled." He flinched, opening his mouth, but I didn't let him speak. "You stood in a church vestibule and told me to enjoy being homeless. You legally kicked me out before our mother's funeral flowers had fully wilted. You looked me in the eye and told me I was nothing but a useless burden. Then you tried to aggressively manipulate me into signing away my rights for $15,000. I stood up from the mahogany table, towering over his seated, defeated frame. "I am absolutely not going to pretend that didn't happen. You have to understand," Mason pleaded, his pitch rising in sheer panic. "I was incredibly stressed. The bad investments, the suffocating financial pressure. I didn't mean half of what I said out there. That is not who I really am." "Then who exactly are you, Mason?" I asked quietly, tilting my head. "Because I have known you for 30 years, and I have never seen a single shred of evidence of anyone different." He physically recoiled. The brutal truth hit him much harder than the loss of the money. "I'm not going to let my own brother become a homeless person on the street," I promised, feeling a strange, solid peace settling deeply into my bones. "I am not a cruel monster, but I am also not going to write a magic check to bail you out of terrible decisions you repeatedly made while treating me like I was completely worthless." "So what then?" he choked out. "You just easily walk away with millions and I get absolutely nothing?" "You get exactly what you earned." I calmly reached down and picked up my bag. It was the same worn, faded leather tote I had proudly carried through grueling nursing school exams. The one that sat faithfully beside me through 3 exhausting years of graveyard shifts. The bag that held my stethoscope while my arrogant family completely dismissed my existence. "You get the heavy consequences of your selfish choices," I told him, slinging the thick strap over my shoulder. "The exact same way I am finally getting the wonderful consequences of mine." Valerie angrily started to speak, her face flushed a blotchy red, but I immediately held up my hand to stop her. "If you ever need to contact me, you can strictly go through Elaine's office, but any personal, emotional relationship between us?" I looked down at my older brother. This was the exact same boy I had grown up with, the kid who had briefly held my tiny hand on our first day of elementary school, who had slowly warped into someone I barely recognized. "That is going to take a lot of time, and honestly, I don't know if we will ever get there." Brooke, I'm not doing this to hurt you, I said steadily, stepping away from the long table. I'm doing it because I finally understand a vital lesson Mom desperately tried to teach me. I do not have to blindly accept treatment that I would never dream of giving to someone else. I walked proudly toward the heavy oak doors. Mom really did love you, I said over my shoulder, refusing to look back. But she loved me enough to aggressively protect me from you. That is the massive difference. I didn't wait around for his hollow response. I pushed open the door and stepped out. The law firm's hallway was beautifully quiet, feeling like a safe, peaceful sanctuary after surviving a violent hurricane. Grandma followed right behind me, her sensible heels clicking on the hardwood. "Wait a moment," she called softly, catching my arm before I reached the polished elevator bank. "I have something very important for you." She reached deep into her elegant purse and withdrew a small velvet box. It was a rich navy blue, the soft corners completely worn down by decades of gentle handling. "Your mother specifically wanted you to have this," she whispered. "She firmly asked me to hand it directly to you the second the legal reading finished." I popped the delicate lid open. Inside rested a stunning sapphire ring. It was the exact piece Grandma had worn proudly on her right hand for as long as I could remember. The shiny jewel I used to admire with wide eyes when I was just a little girl sitting on her lap. "Grandma, I can't take this. This is yours." "It was mine," she corrected gently, a soft, beautiful smile touching her lips. "I lovingly gave it to your mother on her busy wedding day, and she bravely gave it back to me when she knew she was actively dying, specifically so I could place it on your hand when the exact right time arrived." My fingers shook violently as I slid the cool metal onto my hand. It fit absolutely perfectly. "There is something else you urgently need to know," Grandma murmured, her tone turning incredibly serious. "A heavy secret even your brilliant mother refused to put into the official will." I looked up, my heart skipping a rapid beat. "Laura desperately wanted to leave your father years ago, long before you were ever born." "What?" I gasped softly. "I never knew that. Nobody ever knew. But then she got pregnant with Mason, and she felt entirely trapped, so she stayed. She suffered through his coldness for you kids." Grandma's wise eyes were suddenly bright with shining, unshed tears. She made the absolute best of a terrible situation, but she deeply regretted that she couldn't give you a warm, loving childhood. She reached out, her wrinkled finger gently touching the bright sapphire on my hand. "The hidden trust fund, the secret insurance policy, the house, all of it. It was her flawless way of finally giving you the ultimate freedom she never possessed. The absolute freedom to safely walk away from toxic people who refuse to value your incredible worth." I threw my arms tightly around her. I hugged this tiny, fierce woman who had secretly conspired with my dying mother for 9 entire years just to guarantee me a bright, safe future. "Thank you," I sobbed quietly into her shoulder. "Do not thank me, sweetheart," she replied, rubbing my back soothingly. "Just live incredibly well. That is absolutely all your beautiful mother ever wanted." Behind us, the heavy conference room doors finally creaked open. I could hear Mason and Valerie slowly walking out, their defeated voices low and painfully strained. I didn't turn my head to look back at them, because for the first time in my entire existence I was finally looking strictly forward. Life moved with breathtaking, almost dizzying speed after we walked out of that mahogany conference room. I sat quietly in the sleek office of a brilliant financial advisor in Harrisonburg, a woman Elaine had personally recommended. We didn't dawdle, we made a concrete battle plan for my future. My suffocating student loans were entirely cleared in a single, silent computer transaction. Click. The massive trust fund was securely invested for long-term growth. Click. A solid emergency safety net was officially established. Click. The crushing weight I had carried on my shoulders since I was a teenager simply vanished. But I didn't quit my job. I kept my grueling day shifts at Meadowbrook Senior Living because I genuinely loved my fragile patients. The profound difference was that I was finally working out of deep compassion, not out of sheer terror of missing a rent payment. I stayed in Donna's cramped guest room for another month while I slowly figured out what to do about the massive property on Meadow Drive. The house was far too complicated. It was the sacred space where I had painfully nursed Mom through her darkest hours. It was the exact spot where Mason had ruthlessly thrown my belongings into the freezing rain, but it was also the beautiful sanctuary where Mom had faithfully tended her lavender, quietly meeting with expensive lawyers to meticulously build a hidden universe I never knew existed. I just wasn't ready to live there. Not yet. But I adamantly refused to sell it. Instead, I rented it out to a sweet, noisy young family. I let their chaotic joy fill the empty hallways, letting the house breathe and pay for itself while my heavy memories settled. For the very first time in my entire existence, there was absolutely no rush. Mom had gifted me the ultimate luxury, time. 4 months after the explosive will reading, Grandma called me with an update. I was on my lunch break, sitting on the exact same cold concrete stairwell at the hospital where I had originally learned my parents were dead. It is incredibly strange how random places permanently accumulate the heavy moments of our lives. Mason is being forced to sell the Georgetown mansion, Grandma announced, her tone remarkably dry. Valerie officially filed for divorce last Tuesday. How do you know all of this? I asked, leaning my head against the painted cinderblock wall. His desperate real estate listing popped up on Trulia this morning, and Valerie's public Facebook page is currently very, very forthcoming. I could practically hear Grandma rolling her eyes through the phone. She is already loudly rebranding herself as a brave survivor of narcissistic financial abuse. That is a direct quote, by the way. I almost laughed. Almost. Is he okay? Define okay, Grandma sighed heavily. He is currently living in a cramped rented apartment in Boulder. He's still dabbling in real estate, but he was completely let go from his prestigious old firm. I highly doubt anyone is inviting him to those fancy Georgetown cocktail parties anymore. The exhausted, battered version of me from 4 months ago might have felt a vicious spark of triumphant satisfaction, but the new version, the woman who finally had the quiet space to process, to fiercely grieve, and to truly heal, just felt an overwhelming wave of sadness. I don't wish him harm, I whispered to the empty stairwell. I know you don't, sweetheart. That is the massive difference between you and him. Did your mother know about his terrifying debts, his reckless financial trouble? She strongly suspected, Grandma replied gently. That is a huge part of why she did exactly what she did. She knew with absolute certainty that if there was any loose money available, Mason would find a way to selfishly take it. Not because he is inherently evil, Brooke, but because he was brainwashed from birth to believe he was naturally owed it. I thought about my older brother, sitting entirely alone in a small Boulder apartment. His trophy wife was gone. His lavish lifestyle had utterly collapsed. I tried to remember the sweet, messy boy who used to happily chase me around our sunny backyard, the teenager who used to let me ride on his broad shoulders at summer parades. I didn't know where that innocent boy had disappeared to, but I finally accepted a hard truth. I could not save him. I'm driving up to the house this weekend, I told Grandma, breaking the silence. First time since everything exploded. Do you want to keep me company? Yes, she said softly. I think I really do. The famous lavender garden had miraculously survived the brutal Colorado winter, not all of it, of course. Some of the delicate plants had turned brown, brittle, and dead. But there, glowing in the pale, early April sunlight, I could clearly see vibrant new green shoots stubbornly pushing up through the dark, damp soil. Vance and Mason hadn't managed to touch it. It was entirely safe. It was resilient, refusing to surrender to the frost. Grandma stood quietly beside me on the grass, her frail arm linked tightly through mine. The rich, earthy scent of the blooming herbs filled the crisp air. She specifically planted this massive garden the exact year you were born, Grandma murmured, her eyes tracking the purple buds. Did you know that? I shook my head, my throat tightening. I had always foolishly assumed it was just a random hobby she enjoyed, not something loaded with secret meaning. She always told me that lavender was for fierce protection, for deep purification, Grandma explained softly. She desperately wanted good, beautiful things to constantly grow around you. I finally walked up to the heavy back door. I slid my shiny new key into the lock. It turned perfectly. I had hired someone to change the deadbolts weeks ago. Stepping inside, I stood perfectly still in the pristine kitchen. This was the exact spot where I had brewed Mom countless cups of soothing peppermint tea, where I had held her frail hand through waves of terrifying nausea. The house was beautifully quiet. Mason had actually left it relatively clean when he angrily moved his boxes out, either out of some tiny, lingering remnant of basic shame, or simply because he had been too panicked to trash the place. Mom's comforting presence was still everywhere. Her worn recipe cards were safely tucked in the wooden drawer. Her reading glasses rested patiently on the bedside table. Her soft floral robe still hung gently in the hallway closet. I slowly walked into her master bedroom and sat heavily on the edge of the mattress. Resting right in the center of her nightstand was a small, thick leather photo album I had never ever seen before. My hands shook as I cracked the stiff cover open. Inside were dozens of photographs of me, Just me. From squishy infancy all the way to tired adulthood. My wobbly first steps, my nervous first day of kindergarten, my proud nursing school graduation. Every single important milestone she had quietly witnessed was perfectly preserved. On the very first page, written in her beautiful, careful handwriting, were 5 words. For my absolute bravest girl. Grandma sat down gently beside me, resting her chin on my shoulder. She spent weeks meticulously putting that together, she whispered. She worked on it late at night during the worst of the chemo, whenever the pain meant she couldn't sleep. She told me it was her favorite way of counting the good things in her life. I pulled the heavy leather album tightly against my chest, buried my face in my hands, and finally let myself completely break down. But this time, it wasn't agonizing grief pouring out of me. It was pure, overwhelming gratitude. 7 months later, my life looked entirely different. I was officially enrolled in an advanced nurse practitioner program, my expensive tuition covered fully and completely. I finally had the incredible chance to do so much more than basic bedside care. To diagnose, to actively treat, and to deeply help my patients heal. Donna and I eventually found a gorgeous sunny apartment together right near the main hospital. It had 2 spacious bedrooms and a tiny wrought iron balcony where I immediately started growing my own resilient lavender in bright clay pots. Donna jokingly claimed that living completely alone was highly overrated anyway. I shot back that having a reliable roommate just meant I finally had someone to split the expensive streaming subscriptions with. But we both quietly knew it was so much more than that. We were chosen family. Grandma called my cell phone every single Sunday without fail. She would spend hours telling me wild, funny stories about Mom as a fearless teenager. She told me about their crazy road trips before she ever met Dad, about the vibrant, loud woman my mother was long before a cold marriage slowly wore her edges down. I faithfully recorded every single call on my phone, actively building a permanent digital archive of the beautiful mother I was miraculously still getting to know. Back at the house on Meadow Drive, the older daughter of my lovely renters shyly asked if she could be in charge of watering the backyard garden. I smiled and said yes. I said yes to a lot of beautiful things that monumental year, to new educational opportunities, to long weekends of actual rest, to the slow, wonderful process of truly understanding that I was worth infinitely more than I had ever been told. My mother didn't just leave me a pile of cold money. She gave me the ultimate, unbreakable permission to finally believe I deserved a wonderful life. I have spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, thinking deeply about why Mason became the cold man he is. I don't do it to excuse his cruelty. There is absolutely no valid excuse for how terribly he treated me. I do it to finally understand. My brother grew up being constantly loudly told he was incredibly special simply because he happened to be born male. He never had to actually prove his worth. The entire world was handed to him on a silver platter by default. Because of that extreme privilege, he never developed the vital emotional muscles for basic empathy. He never learned the pride of genuinely earning what he had, or the grace of recognizing that other people's needs mattered just as much as his own. Therapists call it severe entitlement, the toxic belief that you fundamentally deserve the absolute best without putting in a single ounce of real effort. It is never born into a person. It is meticulously taught, and once that poison takes root, it is almost impossible to rip out, because admitting you aren't actually a superior being means admitting your entire shiny identity was nothing but a fragile lie. Mason isn't a cartoon monster. He is the tragic product of a broken system that constantly told him he was worth far more than he actually was. And when cold, hard reality finally sprinted up and caught him, his fragile ego simply didn't know how to survive the impact. I honestly don't know if he will ever humble himself enough to change. A small part of me truly hopes he does. But I also finally know, deep in my soul, that fixing him is absolutely not my job. My only real responsibility is to myself, to bravely live the spectacular life Mom sacrificed so much to guarantee for me, to build towering boundaries that fiercely protect my hard-won peace, to remember, forever, that finally walking away from toxic people who refuse to love you isn't an act of cruelty. It is an act of beautiful, necessary survival. If you are listening to my story right now, and you have spent your entire life being told you are not enough, by your own parents, by selfish partners, by the exact people who were supposed to protect your heart, I need you to hear me loud and clear. They were wrong. You were always, always enough. Sometimes the quiet people who love us protect us in massive, invisible ways we can't fully see until the storm breaks. And sometimes we have to find the absolute courage to finally become our own fierce protectors. That is the greatest lesson I learned from the woman who grew lavender in the dark. If my messy journey meant something to you, I would genuinely love to read your thoughts down in the comments. Tell me about the quiet hero who bravely protected you, or tell me about the exact moment you finally decided to stand up and fiercely protect yourself. And if you want more stories about finding your power when the world tries to take it away, check out the links in the description below. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. It means more to me than you will ever know.